the technology was not agreeing with Mike. It's an Adobe Connect issue. So you might not see him, but you will hear him shortly.
Thanks, Nick. Good afternoon, everybody. As Nick said, the Halloween gremlins have stopped my camera from working for this. So, but I thankfully am not the main presenter today. We have three great individuals to talk about some different things that are going to be or are going on in the profession. So, I wanted to, excuse me. Kind of just highlight this. As Nick said, this is not a CPE webinar, but this is similar to a lot of webinars that we do here at the WSCPA. So I know we have a lot of people here today who are not members of the WSCPA. If this is something you find interesting, we do offer these more regularly and usually for CPE going up closer to the hour mark or going to the hour mark. So that's something that's interesting to you and you're able to, that's an option out there in the future. But first, I just wanted to introduce everyone. So we have today, we have Mark Hughes, CPA. He's also a former board member for the Washington Board of Accountancy. And he was instrumental in getting a lot of these rules passed in this past year, although he is no longer on the Board of Accountancy. So he's going to walk us through a lot of what the Board of Accountancy adopted this year. Kimberly Scott, President and CEO of the Washington Society, she's here to talk about a lot of the impact these rule changes are going to have for candidates and students. And then we have Lindsay Patterson here today. She's the founder or co-founder and CEO of CPA Quality Pro, which is a product that the Washington Society has been working with to help address some of the mobility issues that Mark, Kimberly, and Lindsay will all be discussing here. So we are very excited to have the three of them join us, and I will turn it over to them so they have as much time as possible. Mark, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mike. Well, for about 20 years, to be a CPA, it was required, among other requirements, to have 150 semester hours of college education. Excuse me, roughly about 5 years. And this was always unpopular. Now, I was on the Board of Accountancy for 8.5 years. I ended my terms on the board at the end of last year. And when I started on the board 8.5 years ago, the 150 hours as a requirement was always unpopular. And when I started on the board, though, I thought it would never change. I thought it would never get better. And that's because it wasn't an inherently local decision. Washington is a sovereign state. It makes its own decision, but all the states were kind of chained together through this thing called mobility. So it made it not an inherently local decision, a hard inherently local decision. And the national organizations really weren't behind changing this. They were kind of too entrenched. But over time, during the time I was on the board, it was amazing. Pressure from especially the state societies and boards kind of started a process of change, regardless of the national organizations, that they've kind of come along begrudgingly. And one of the key players in this was the WSCPA, and especially Kimberly Scott, in taking leadership at the national level, making these changes move forward. So it was pretty amazing, because when I started on the board, I never thought we'd see these changes. And it just goes to prove that when you think things won't change, well, they will change if you get the right leadership. So during the last year, the board has adopted 5 rules that we're going to talk about today. One is called about mobility, which is really important. And this was the thing that chained all the states together. And then recently at the October meeting, the board changed the education requirements to get an initial CPA license. So the board changed the rule for individual education requirements, experience requirements to be a licensed CPA, modified the rules for verification and the rules for individual licensing. So I'll kind of briefly discuss all of those. The first rule, individual mobility, is already in effect. The last 4 are so new, they're not going to be in effect till 31 days after the October board meeting, so sometime later on this month. So mobility was the kind of the chain that held all the states together. And this is kind of the chain that was broken. And this is really important. If you're already a licensed CPA and we talk about these changes to new licensing, you may say, well, how does this affect me? Well, it does affect you because of this concept of mobility. The CPA licensing is kind of a unique license. It's kind of like a driver's license. You can practice in other states without getting a license. That's a unique license. Talk to your lawyer, talk to your doctor. They can't do that. They can't go practice in another state, but CPAs, we can, because it's just like a driver's license. I was talking to my pharmacist and she's thinking about retiring to Arizona where her daughter lives, but she says, but I'm not going to do that because I'd have to pass the Arizona Board of Pharmacology licensing requirement. But CPAs, we've always, for many years, we've had this ability to practice freely in other states without getting any kind of license. In the last year, my top 10 revenue clients by revenue, the number one was California. I think number 5 and 6 were Oregon. I don't have a California license. I don't have an Oregon license. How can I serve clients in those states without violating the law in those states? Well, this thing called mobility. And so I always call mobility the gift that we don't appreciate, because all CPA licensing is local. And when you serve a client in another state in your public practice, that is a consumer in another state governed by a consumer protection agency in another state, for example, the California Board of Accountancy. So what do I have to do to comply with their laws and rules? And for quite a few years, there's been this mobility among almost all the states, Hawaii is an exception, that said, well, as long as the initial licensing requirements to be in your state were equivalent to ours, we would allow you to practice. We would allow you to practice mobility. You don't have to notify the board, pay a fee, or pay a license. So these initial licensing requirements, as they change, has kind of broken this chain of mobility and our ability to practice in other states through these things called practice privileges. So this was the chain that held us all together. And this is the chain that has been broken. So while we have these new licensing requirements are really fantastic, existing CPAs, you have to be careful now about other states because you may not have the automatic right to practice in that other state. So why is mobility a good thing? Mobility benefits the public. It creates more consumer choices. You're free to choose the CPA firm or the employee to choose their individual business or needs. Why is my number one client from California? Because I got this big Washington tax appeal going on for that client. Removing state boundaries creates more price competition among competitors. And a board's ability to discipline is based on where the consumer is located, not where the licensee is located. So this is the consumer protection element. And mobility is really good for CPAs and firms, right? You can have a nationwide market. You can freely practice. You could freely practice in other states without worrying about big statewide market, and you didn't have to worry about minor foot faults, troubling licensing problems in other states. So in order to, as part of the series and rules, early in the year, the board created what was called automatic mobility. So this is the board saying, okay, if you're from another state serving a client in Washington, this isn't about licensing, right? Mobility and practice privileges is like a temporary right to practice in another state, consumer service in another state. It says as long as the licensing requirements in that other state, if you have a license in good standing in that other state, and it met certain minimum requirements, right? You took the CPA exam, you have a minimum of a college education, you have a minimum 1-year experience, we'll recognize that license in Washington. This is kind of called automatic mobility. And this is the gold standards for states to adopt as these changes happen nationwide throughout the country to kind of repair what is being fractured. Now, only about half the states are passing a lot of the changes we're going to talk about today, so half aren't. So now if you're a CPA in public practice, practicing in other states, you need to be more sensitive to the idea of mobility. So you can offer services in the state by phone, electronic means, by email, no notice, no requirement, no fee. By doing so, you automatically agree to some things. And in the interest of time, I won't go through all these, but you basically agree that the board has jurisdiction over you. If there's any restrictions on your license, they apply in the license of the state you're serving. Now, the Washington board passing this doesn't really do any benefit for a Washington licensee practicing in another state, but this is the board showing this is a model we're going to adopt. We hope other states adopt it, and many have, to make it easy for when you're a Washington licensee to practice in another state. But mobility is the thing that affects existing licensees. So the other board rules that the board recently adopted, which are really exciting changes, is now instead of one pathway to be a CPA, 150 hours of college education, CPA exam, and 1 year of experience, there's now 3 different pathways. There is a baccalaureate degree with accounting concentration or equivalent, a post-baccalaureate degree like a master's degree with accounting concentration equivalent, or a baccalaureate degree with basically an additional 30 hours, the kind of the old rule, 150 hours. Note both of these remove the hour requirement, the first 2, because college is kind of changing. And with those changes now, there's different experience requirements. If you get a baccalaureate degree with accounting concentration equivalent, you have to get 2 years of experience. If you get a master's degree or do the 150-hour rule, you still have to get only 1 year of experience. So this is a very, very exciting time and makes the profession far more accessible. So I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly now.
Thank you, Mark. There we go. I was gonna say my camera didn't want to go on, but we're there now. So, the big question that I get, well, I get lots of questions when I go out, but one that seems to have a lot of excitement both for educators and that next generation of CPAs is, what does this mean for me? Which pathway should I take? I will tell you that, a lot of those decisions are going to be yours alone. As Mark was talking about the mobility issues that we're going to have, most states are and plan to work towards the national guidance so that we can all get there soon, but there's going to be some issues for a while. So if you are a student and you want to be a CPA, 1, thank you. We're here for you. Let me know if we can help you out. But 2, your decisions are going to have to be yours personally. Do you think you're going to be working in the state of Washington? Then you're probably fine in any of those pathways, not going to be an issue. If you think that you are going to maybe work for a larger firm, a regional firm, and you want to do work outside of the state in the next couple of years during this transition time, you might want to look for the pathway that we've already had, because most of the states, still have that. They are all going to be equal to CPAs. It's just going to be a rough place for a couple of years. So depending on where you're at in your pathway, I've attached 2 different charts, 2 different papers that are in the handouts for you, and they can kind of walk you through the different reasons why you might choose one or the other. But I will tell you at the end, CPA is going to equal CPA. So whatever journey you take to get there, we are here for you. And we are absolutely thrilled that you want to be a CPA, especially in the state of Washington. We are trying to save some time at the end to answer questions that are coming through. We want to make sure that we do answer your questions. So I made my part really, really short, hoping that these handouts will actually answer some of those questions, both for the educators on here and for the students. And I'm going to pass this back on to Lindsay, because I am guessing there are a lot of CPAs that currently have a license that heard what Mark said and maybe hadn't thought about that before for their mobility. And I'd like Lindsay to kind of walk us through a tool that has been developed to help you with that. And then, of course, circle back for any questions that you have.
All right. Thank you so much, Kimberly. As she was mentioning, we've looked at the impact on students, but this will absolutely have an impact on firms and individual CPAs over the next few years. It's going to be a little bumpy. And so let's look at what some of those challenges might be. We know that there's opportunities that we already discussed, but there's also still going to be 55 different sets of laws and rules. Here are some examples just to give you kind of insight into what this looks like already. So we have California, for example. If you want to provide tax services in that state, you are good with mobility under the California Board of Accountancy, but you still have to register with the California Tax Education Council. If you want to do work in Florida, you might have mobility there, but the firm needs to make sure that it's in compliance with the board rules related to, minimum capitalization and letters of credit. So these are some of the nuances amongst the different 55 rules and laws that can sometimes get overlooked. A few other examples for you. Notify board within 30 days of changes in any address. I wanted to point this one out because as we're looking at what people are getting dinged for by state boards of accountancy, this one comes up oftentimes in a state where a firm is practicing under mobility but is not licensed, because we often think, oh, I'm licensed in Washington, I've moved my firm address or my home address, I'm going to update that within the 30 days with my home board of accountancy, but you need to make sure that you're doing that in other states where you have practice privileges as well. And then the way that we're counting it up, we consider there's 10 different mobility systems. So systems for determining individual mobility. You could argue what these are. I don't want you to get too caught up in what the map looks like, but this is, how we have determined what mobility requirements are. So some states will have the 150-hour requirement written into legislation and rules. Other states rely on an outside review to determine if the firm or me as an individual, if I can go into that state and be deemed substantially equivalent and have mobility privileges there. Many states, like the ones in purple, they're moving to an automatic mobility system, which says that a CPA in good standing can practice. But even within some of these automatic mobility states, there are differences. Some states will say a CPA is a CPA no matter how you got that license. But other states will have some guardrails, such as passing the CPA exam, having a bachelor's degree, or alternatively, the language might specify having 120 hours of college education. So really what I want you to take away here is that there is going to be a little bit of bumpiness over the next few years as we get aligned on mobility across all 55 jurisdictions. And in speaking to a lot of firms, what we're hearing so far is that most firms are just managing their licenses through spreadsheets, calendar reminders. So if you accidentally close that reminder from Outlook that your license is about to expire, you might end up getting dinged from the state board. Obviously, risks here, missed deadlines, unauthorized activity. So maybe under the new mobility laws, you put somebody on an engagement in Texas, and that individual does not actually have mobility under Texas new rules, as just one example. And then the impacts of that, you could face penalties. You could have a fine, you could lose revenue from your clients. Again, we don't want to scare anybody, but we want to make sure that firms are taking the appropriate steps to protect themselves over the next few years. Reputational damage, I'm sure you're all aware, CPA Verify, individual can go into that and they're going to see if a firm or an individual has had a finding against them. And these are not theoretical. It's not just, oh, this could happen under new mobility systems. This has been happening for years already. Here are a couple of examples that I just pulled from the last few months from board minutes. I blacked out the names to protect the apparently guilty, but here in Minnesota, we had a firm that was fined $5,000 because they were not appropriately registered in the state, but they were practicing in the state. Same thing in Texas. This individual, their license had lapsed. They had not renewed it. So they ended up losing their license over that because they continued to provide attest services in that state. New York, same thing. Firm got put on probation for 2 years. They had a $2,000 fine, again, because their license lapsed. So we want to make sure that we're staying on top of this. That's what CPA Quality Pro is designed to do. It is a software that we've been working on with the Washington Society. So we're so grateful for Kimberly's support and for seeing the need very early on. Kimberly reached out quite early to say, this is going to be an issue and we need to do something to help our firms. So what CPA Quality Pro does is it helps firms with individual license and tracking, with that mobility guidance, sending those automated renewal reminders, your license is coming up for expiration. It helps with document storage. So anything related to a license, the license itself, information from the State Board of Accountancy, documents maybe related to your peer review that you want to save, you can have those all in one place. Here's an example of what the dashboard looks like for tracking both that firm and individual licenses and mobility across all those states. But even more so than the dashboard, something that we wanted to give you guys a preview of is the determination of firm mobility and individual mobility. So here's just an example of that. I'm going to zoom in so you can see a little bit more. let's say this individual, their firm has a license in Utah. They want to provide an attest engagement in the state of Washington. So they would let us know, here's where I'm licensed, here's a service I want to provide in what state, and then here are the individuals that I want to put on that engagement. This is obviously dummy data, but in this example, Amelia, she is not okay to practice in Washington under the most recent mobility laws, whereas Ibrahim, he'd be good to go. So this is sort of information that you'll be able to see. Again, Washington Society is way ahead of the curve on this. The product goes live just in a couple of days. It'll be live with mobility in November. So if this is something that you all are interested in, we have a special discount just for Washington Society members who are active members. You can see that here, but also reach out if you have any questions on mobility at all. Happy to answer any questions that you have either today or later on if you think of any. And I have seen a lot of questions come in, so hopefully we can get to several of these.
Yeah, and I see that Mark has been answering some in there. Mike, are you still on here? And
I've been trying to monitor these, and Mark is doing his best to answer a lot of them in here. So I might pull you in, Mark, to answer some of these live. But one of the ones that I kind of wanted to highlight first that Mark did answer, but just wondering if, well, I can read Mark's answer out here, but it was around whether or not or how the experience is verified when you're applying for licensure. And just Mark highlighted that the Washington Board of Accounts uses a third-party verifier for credit hours and whether or not your license applies, whether or not what the degree and the classes for that degree meet the various requirements for education here in Washington. So if you have kind of specific questions for your specific degree or if you're an educator for your school's degree program, we just encourage you to talk to the state board to make sure that it's meeting what they're requiring or what they're seeing on their end. One thing too, I do want to just highlight, I haven't seen it in the chat yet, but I thought it would be a good thing to bring up. If you are either a candidate or as you're an educator working with candidates for this in the short term here, like Mark said, these rules will go into effect sometime at the end of November. But we've talked to the board because we've had a couple people see these changes are coming and apply now. The way that the law is written currently is that when you apply for your initial licensure, you are held to the rules that are in place when you apply. So anybody who applies now is still going to be subject to the 150-hour rule for education. So if you're a candidate or an educator who's working with candidates who want to use one of the new pathways, you need to make sure that you wait or that they wait to apply after these changes go into effect. Again, that we don't know the exact date yet. The state board is still working with the state code revisor's office to get the exact date, but it should be sometime in late November.
And can I jump in? Because I see a few questions about where your consumer is located. So yes, if you have a client in another state, you need to be checking that specific state's rules, and they will be more stringent for attest engagements, but that's something that I would recommend you look at regardless of the service that you are providing. Because again, every state is going to have those little nuances that you want to make sure you're meeting their rules around.
Mark, do you have anything to add to that? Because yes, that's been a common, there's lots of variations on that, but that's one of the main things is, whether it's paying income taxes to another state, if the client lives in Washington, or, kind of all of those different nuances to that and how that applies to, again, existing CPAs, not necessarily the CPAs under these new pathways.
And this is why mobility, I mean, each state is a sovereign state, and each state gets to set its own rules. And there's been this kind of a general agreement among most states, not Hawaii, in the past, as far as these rules. But now those are all fractured, and these rules are being changed locally. And this is all local consumer protection. So you need to check those local rules. And some people have been asking questions about attest services. And mobility for firms is even more restrictive in other states. Some states, about a third of the states, will still require you have a license in that other state to serve a consumer in that other state. So you need to check that other state. And we've kind of taken this for granted because it's been very uniform in the past. So we're not going to get punished for minor foot faults, which affect our license. And Lindsay had some great examples. But now we have to be more careful about those for the next few years.
And if I can just add, so this substantial equivalency that gave us mobility in the first place, again, back to Mark's point, that was based on the state that you were licensed in. So Washington State was considered substantially equivalent to the other states, which is why you had that mobility. The big issue with that is all of these states are making changes. The whole state goes down. It's not just, so it doesn't matter how you got your license. With this new practice privilege that all of the states are trying to move to, is to this new mobility, we'll actually just leave it for you. So however you got your license, if that's going to be accepted in another state, that's going to give you a lot more stability moving forward, no matter how states move in the future. So we are trying to future proof this so that we don't end up in a position like this again. And we all knew that it was going to create a hiccup along the way. But I think I'm very thrilled looking at all the states that we have 25 states that have actually made a change this year already. That's pretty great right out the door that everybody was moving that fast.
Yeah.
And I saw a question about CPE, and I feel like I'm the one coming in on this presentation with all the scary news. So right now, I don't know about Washington specific, but there are a lot of states that are looking at changes to CPE requirements. So I will just plant this in your head right now. If you have clients in other states, you should probably pay attention to what those states are doing when it comes to CPE requirements.
And there's one question in here. Hopefully it's a positive note. To answer the question, there was a question, if you are a Washington CPA serving Washington clients only, the mobility issue does not apply. So just want to make that very clear. The mobility issue is just if you are licensed in Washington, or if you're licensed in a different state trying to come into Washington. But if you are licensed in a state serving clients in that same state, the mobility issue is not a problem for you.
95% of the time. Sorry, I have one other caveat on that.
Well, if you want to move, right? If you're planning on
if
moving.
you didn't move, because I am licensed in Washington State. I do not live in Washington State right now. If I were to serve clients in Washington State, living in Florida, I would need a Florida license.
Okay, so yes, the caveat being you're a Washington licensee living in Washington, serving Washington clients. Mobility is not an issue for you.
Correct.
So for that, yes, is and that residency requirement gets into a whole different issue that we don't have time to get into. And then I just wanted to highlight, there was a comment around just obviously the nuances with all of this mobility and the challenges here for the next couple of years. Yes, the changes to mobility are difficult right now. The hope, I will say, from a national standpoint, and the reason you've seen so many states, like Kimberly was saying, moving already to this national model that the AICPA and NASBA and everybody's kind of got on board with, is that the individual mobility we're moving to is supposed to be a better mobility model for the future, instead of having it be state specific. So while there are challenges right now, the hope is, obviously the other 30 jurisdictions, since we have 5 territories, but that they all come along to the individual mobility in the near future, so that hopefully all of this calms down soon. But I know there are more questions in the chat that we don't have time to get to around Canada, and I'm sure other things. So I just want to highlight my email address is there on the screen or in the slides. If you download those, you can send me an email. I can get in touch with any of the 3 here, and I can get your question answered. We will also take the chat questions, and we can try to get back to you at that point. Thank you, Jeanette. She put my email there in the chat. So if we were not able to get to your questions, or if you have a very specific question, feel free to reach out, and we're happy to get an answer to that.
Yeah. But if the question's in the chat, we'll make sure you get a response.
Yeah.
Great. And with that, we are indeed at time. Thank you all for attending. Since this event isn't a CPE event, it's not the case that you have to fill out a survey. I did put together a short one if you want to share some thoughts, just to sort of like let us know what you thought of this, and good opportunity to share any comments you might have. I will and with that, I don't have to say the certificate thing. No certificates, not CPE. But thank you all for the great questions. I also want to note that I am indeed taking the questions in the chat offline now, so I'll be able to get those to presenters, and we'll get answers out to everybody registered as soon as possible. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks.